Nice to see you.
Okay, so the course is Advanced Contract and Financial Management. We have 4 chapters and 12 learning outcomes. 4 chapters, no, and in learning outcome 1 chapter 1, in chapter 1, so we have 4 learning outcomes. In chapter 2, we have 3, making 7. In chapter 3, we also have 3, making 10. And then in chapter 4, we also have 3, making 13. So we have 13 learning outcomes. 13 learning outcomes. I'm going to use about 10 minutes to just summarize everything we are going to do in this model, just to give us a clear idea of what we are diving into. In chapter 1, learning outcome 1.1, it's a familiar area. We are going to talk about KPIs, key performance indicators. Look at what KPIs are, look at how we even develop KPIs, look at the benefits and downsides of KPIs. Then we look at some examples of KPIs. It's very short. Then learning outcome 1.2 is a little comprehensive. We'll look at the methods for measuring performance. Yes, I know in level 4 you might have done supplier performance measurement, but this is a different approach altogether. We'll look at 7 ways you can measure a supplier's performance. First of all, you would have to collect and then analyze data. You can also develop KPIs in the area of innovation. You can also develop KPIs in the area of time. You can also use integration as part of your performance measurement. Then you can do your cost and benefit analysis. Then you balance qualitative and quantitative measure. Then finally, you do your return on investment. And like you see, these are not things you might have done in measuring supplier performance. It's a little different. Then in learning outcome 1.3, it's a familiar area. We talk about supplier development. What is supplier development? The process involved in supplier development, the strategies and approaches involved in supplier development. Then in learning outcome 1.4, we'll talk about the techniques to promote innovation. We have cross-functional working, we have simultaneous engineering, we have early supplier involvement, then we have supplier forums and associations. And you should know that the supplier development that we did is also part of the innovation. So that's what we do for learning outcome 1.4. In chapter 2, it's all about sourcing. It's all about sourcing. In D3, sourcing in level 4, you did sourcing, all the courses sourcing, and this very chapter is about sourcing. In 2.1, we are going to look at the factors you consider before you even determine whether to source or not. We'll look at industry dynamics like the purchase price forces, like the industry life cycle. We'll also look at pricing behavior. We'll look at demand and supply. We'll look at elasticity of demand. We'll also look at financial data on suppliers in terms of their liquidity, their profitability ratios, their investment ratios, and the efficiency ratios. Then you would even look at concepts like stakeholder involvement. So I'm talking about the Menlo power and interest method. All these are things you consider before you buy. That's for 2.1. Then in 2.2, we'll look at our sourcing options, which are also considered in D3. Look at the contract type and duration. We'll also look at whether you go for negotiation or you go in for competitive tendering. You also decide whether you go for single sourcing or multiple sourcing. You can even consider using e-auctions. So all these are ways you can approach the market, and these are the sourcing options. Then in learning outcome 2.3, we'll look at the criteria for selecting suppliers. In sourcing, this was course selection criteria. We have the technical, we have the financial, we have the production capacity. So many. Here would add a lot. Would even add reputation and all that. Chapter 2, it's all about sourcing. Then in chapter 3, they are going to talk about money, finance. So in 3.1, they are going to look at the financial objectives of different companies. Some have value for money, some have cost, some have profitability. We look at these. Then we look at the types of costs. And these are also from level 4. Then we look at how to deal with costs, overhead costs. There are 3 ways in which you can deal with overhead costs. We'll look at all these when we get there. Then we look at working capital, which is very important. How do your company fund its working capital? We would even look at the approaches to working capital. We have the aggressive approach, we have the conservative approach. We look at all these things. Then we'll also look at project funding, the sources of funding when it comes to projects. Then we look at the long-term and then the medium-term sources of finance. It's all about money, it's all about finance in learning outcome 3.1. Then in 3.2, we look at the exchange rate. What is exchange rate? What are the types of exchange rates? We have the fixed, we have the floating. What would even cause the exchange rate to fluctuate? Then how do we manage exchange rate fluctuation? Then in 3.3, we look at commodities. What are commodities? What are the types of commodities? We have 2 types of commodities, the hard commodities, the soft commodities. Then we'll look at what again will cause our commodity prices to fluctuate. Then how do we manage commodity price fluctuations? How do we manage commodity price fluctuations? And the good news here is the way you manage exchange rates are the same as the way you manage commodities. So, and these are technical things that you have to learn them once. Chapter 3. Then in chapter 4, we are still going to continue with the KPIs that will start today in learning outcome 4.1. We'll look at KPIs in the area of cost again. We'll look at KPIs in the area of processes. We'll look at KPIs in the area of time. We'll look at KPIs in the area of customer satisfaction and other areas. Then we'll look at finance again into detail, balance sheet, profit and loss account, and the ratios that we have to consider in learning outcome 2.1 are also here. So we'll not repeat it. Either we do it there or we do it here. We have to agree. I prefer to do it in learning outcome 2.1. Then we look at the balance scorecard. Then we come to 4.2. 4.2 is all about stakeholders, the impact that stakeholder feedback would have on your supply chain strategy. So before we dive into the stakeholders, we'll look at the 3 levels of strategy. We have the corporate, we have the business, we have the functional. Then we'll look at the need for these levels of strategy to align with each other. Then we start talking about stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? The types of stakeholders, internal, connected, external stakeholders. Then we look at our Mendel's power and interest metrics. And then sources of stakeholder feedback. And then the purposes for engaging your stakeholders. Then finally, last but not the least, we look at benchmarking, which is also another familiar area from level 4. What is benchmarking? What are the reasons for benchmarking? Look at benchmarking as an improvement tool. Then we look at an interesting concept under benchmarking called the supply chain operations reference. It's another dynamic to benchmarking. Then we look at the types of benchmarking: internal, competitor, generic, functional benchmarking. Then the appraised benchmarking, the benefits, the downsides of benchmarking. Then finally, the approaches or the process for benchmarking. It's an interesting model, and I would also try as much as possible to make it interesting as well. But I can't do this on my own. I'll need the help. So, Carol, Adelaide, and Devlin, This is the overview for L5M4. Please, any question?
That will be very interesting.
It is, and even chapter 2 is also very interesting. Yes, chapter 2 is interesting. When we start looking at the ways in which we can manage the exchange rate and then commodities, it's very, very interesting. There are so many technical things in here, but it can still be taught on phone because in November we taught it on phone, and those who even studied via phone, most of them had distinction. And I know you can even do better. Yes, I know you can even do better. Because that was the very first time we taught it. And this is our second attempt. And it will be much better than last year. So with your permission, I would want to start learning outcome 1.1. And please, to be on the same page, we'll use the teaching guide. I sent Carol some documents. I know you have printed them, yes. That is what we'll use in class for simplicity's sake, to aid the comprehension. In your personal learning, you have a lot of case studies in the original book. You can make reference to them. Additional information, you can get it from it. So let's make use of the teaching guide. So now, we are looking at KPIs, key performance indicators. Without any specific definition, KPIs are clear, quantitative, and qualitative objectives that state performance or that state desired performance in critical areas against which performance can be measured. All I'm saying is KPIs are objectives that indicate to us if something has been done well or not. That is KPI. And we always say that KPIs have to be stated in a smarter way. It should be specific. It should be measurable. It should be attainable. It should be realistic. It should be time bound. It should be evaluated. It should be responsible. Once your KPIs are smarter, it becomes easier for your supplier or the supply chain to effect it. But how do we even develop KPIs? And there's this, should I say, misconception, or we've been interchanging KPIs with something. Let's get it straight. KPIs are not certain things. If I ask you to start mentioning KPIs for me, I know you start mentioning cost, quality, time, speed, safety, isn't it? These are the things you are going to mention. But I would only accept that if I'm speaking to a non-supply chain person. But for supply chain professionals or people studying CIPS, these are not KPIs. Why do I say that? Let's look at figure 1.1. You want to understand KPIs before we even dive into it itself. Look at figure 1.1 in the teaching guide. You see that it's important that KPIs align with your company's objectives, with your company's corporate strategy. If it doesn't, you will not even get companies to disburse money to invest into it, because it can be time consuming, it can be very expensive. So it needs to align with what your company stands for. And the corporate strategy would be broken down to what we call the supply chain strategy. Every company has a functional strategy. And out of the functional strategy, you would have supply chain strategy, you have HR, you have marketing, all the departments would have their strategy. We are only focusing on supply chain because this is what we are doing. So out of your supply chain strategy, your company will set KPIs. At the beginning of the year, are you giving KPIs? Hello? At the beginning of the year, are you giving KPIs?
Yeah, now we are.
Good. So the KPIs will not be established in isolation. Your KPIs in the field where you are will be different from another person's KPI in another department. So your KPI should align with your departmental strategy. And in this context, our department is supply chain, whether you even practice it or not for learning purposes. Now, look at the supply chain strategy. After that, what happens? We have a strategy into what? Into what we call CSS. Do you know the full meaning of the CSS?
Critical success factors.
Good. That is what we normally say as KPIs.
Mm-hmm.
Critical factors are the key areas we measure: quality, cost, delivery, safety, innovation. These are areas we measure in our supply chain. These are not KPIs. Let me state it again. These are not KPIs. These are only critical factors or critical success factors that have to be measured. But in an exam, I can ask you to give me 5 KPIs. In effect, the examiner believes you know that these are not KPIs, so you have to first of all state the critical factors before you give me KPIs in these areas. If I've succeeded in confusing you, kindly let me know. Have I?
No.
I've not confused you.
Mm.
So even if I tell you KPIs, first of all, you have to mention the critical factors before you start mentioning the KPIs. Don't worry, we'll do that. We'll give examples of critical factors and then we'll generate KPIs before we wrap up the learning outcome. So you get it. And then out of the CSS, what happens? Comes the KPIs. And it's your KPIs that can help me determine if in the area of cost you are doing well or not. Look at figure 1.2. Figure 1.2 is not different from figure 1.1. In fact, we even prefer figure 1.1. The reason is figure 1.1 believes that before you come up with your KPI, you should align with your company's objectives. The second one doesn't do that. Look at the second one. You identify critical factors, which is part of the first one. Then from there, you come up with the KPI. The only different thing here is after you come up with the KPI, it has to be agreed with your key stakeholders. Sustainability requires that I don't impose them on you. That was why I called Carol and then we agreed on the time. So that's KPI. Your company shouldn't just develop the KPIs and then impose it on you. You should have a say in those KPIs. So figure 1.1, figure 1.2 are saying the same thing. How we develop KPIs. And in this model at this level, it's highly unlikely they would ask you to give this process. You in your introduction would have to provide it. It's mandatory. We need good introductions, and some of these things can help you in developing a very good introduction. Now let's go to evaluation of KPIs. And the course is constructed. And with constructed, we are not bound to limit ourselves to the book. No, we wouldn't do that at all. So I'm going to engage you a lot. Think outside the box, think outside the book, be innovative in your responses. Can you help me with some benefit of KPIs? And I'll set the pace. I'll start. Once I start, then you can follow. One benefit of KPI is it's a proactive conflict resolution tool. You see, when KPIs are stated in a smarter way, it prevents conflict because Adelaide knows that this is it. This is what has been agreed, and for that matter, she doesn't overstep her boundaries. I also know that this is it. This is what has been agreed. I don't overstep my boundaries. I know A has to do this. I know B has to do this. It's so clear. Even if conflict should occur, this same KPI is a document which we can easily refer to and then use it to manage the conflict. So in the end, KPIs becomes a good conflict resolution tool. Can you think of any other benefit of KPIs?
And you to track whether the supplier is supplying.
So KPIs are, in fact, that's what we are doing it here. It applies to track the supplier's performance, tells you whether the supplier is on track or not. And sometimes, after you've measured the supplier's performance, you could determine to even develop the supplier to close certain gaps. And the gaps you identify are risk, vulnerability. So someone can even argue that KPI is a risk management tool that helps you identify risk within a supplier's performance.